Wood splinters, twisted metal, and the sharp, acrid scent of sulfur marked the aftermath of a phantom. For nearly 2 decades, an unknown assailant terrorized the United States, utilizing the postal system as a delivery mechanism for lethal, entirely untraceable explosives. Traditional detective work yielded nothing but fragmented bomb components and frustrating dead ends. The perpetrator left no fingerprints, no DNA, and no witnesses at the blast sites. The FBI faced an impenetrable wall of physical evidence that simply refused to speak. The Unabomber task force rapidly grew into the most expensive and exhaustive domestic manhunt in American history. Thousands of leads were chased into oblivion, and the psychological toll on federal investigators mounted with every subsequent detonation. The behavioral profiles generated by early criminal psychologists proved overly broad, failing to effectively narrow the massive suspect pool. How could federal agents track a ghost who operated in total isolation, leaving no physical trace of his identity or location? The answer arrived not in the form of another explosive device, but in a sprawling 35,000-word manuscript. In 1995, the elusive bomber mailed a dense philosophical treatise to major news outlets, accompanied by a chilling and specific ultimatum. If the manifesto was published in full, the bombings would permanently cease. This document represented a massive deviation from the suspect's previous operational security, providing the first substantial window into the mind of the killer. Federal authorities faced an unprecedented ethical and tactical dilemma. Capitulating to a domestic terrorist's demands violated standard protocol, yet the FBI recognized the manuscript as the most significant piece of evidence collected in 17 grueling years. According to declassified investigative logs, the decision to authorize publication was a highly calculated risk. The strategy relied entirely on the hope that someone somewhere would recognize the distinct ideological cadence of the anonymous author. This monumental gamble forced a profound transition within the investigation, moving the primary focus from physical ballistics to the emerging, highly specialized science of forensic linguistics. Investigators realized that the manifesto was a crime scene in itself, constructed not of wire and galvanized pipe, but of vocabulary and complex syntax. Every sentence structure, every punctuation choice, and every idiosyncratic phrasing held the potential to act as a definitive identifying fingerprint. Forensic linguistics examines language as quantifiable, objective data. Analysts meticulously dissect written communication to isolate a suspect's idiolect, which is the unique linguistic pattern developed over a lifetime of reading, education, and regional influence. Unlike handwriting, which can be consciously disguised, the deep structural architecture of a person's grammar is incredibly difficult to mask over the course of 35,000 words. The FBI began to construct an entirely new kind of profile, built exclusively on structural linguistic markers. Analysts isolated highly specific archaic phrasing, rigid academic formatting, and obscure ideological terminology embedded deeply within the text. The author utilized precise, mid-century academic structuring and demonstrated a distinct preference for particular esoteric philosophical arguments. These were not the chaotic ramblings of an uneducated outcast, but the highly structured arguments of a formally educated, deeply isolated individual. The linguistic profile was finally complete, but it remained a complex lock without a corresponding key.
The entire investigation now hinged on a critical, lingering unknown. The forensic linguistics profile was virtually useless without a comparative baseline to measure it against. Somewhere in the world, an earlier private document had to exist that shared this exact lexical DNA. The urgent question was no longer where the bomber was hiding, but who had read his distinctive words before they were printed in the national press. Hundreds of miles away, the controversial publication of the Manifesto triggered a devastating realization. David Kaczynski, reading the dense text in the Washington Post, recognized an unsettling, undeniable familiarity in the prose. The rigid arguments against industrial society
echoed the deeply held, aggressively private beliefs of his estranged brother. The cadence of the Manifesto was a ghost from his own family history, forcing an agonizing and immediate moral reckoning. To verify his growing suspicions, David searched his family home, locating a collection of personal letters and early essays written by his brother decades prior. These private, handwritten documents were the exact missing baseline the FBI desperately needed.
The letters contained the same rigid ideological frameworks, the same obscure vocabulary, and the same underlying hostility toward technological advancement that saturated the widely published manuscript. Approaching federal authorities meant initiating a legal process that could ultimately end in his brother's execution. Yet driven by the absolute certainty of the linguistic parallels and the terrifying threat of future violence, David retained legal counsel and provided the private letters to the FBI. This crucial transfer of evidence bridged the massive gap between the public terror of the Unabomber and the private, secluded isolation of a single suspect. Within the secure confines of the FBI laboratory, forensic linguist James Fitzgerald began a meticulous line-by-line comparative analysis. The task was to scientifically prove that the author of the private letters and the anonymous author of the Manifesto were the exact same individual. This required moving far beyond mere thematic similarities to establish a statistically significant alignment of syntax, spelling variations, and deeply ingrained structural formatting. The resulting linguistic match was undeniable and mathematically profound. The analysis revealed identical, highly idiosyncratic phrases across both sets of documents. Most notably, both authors inverted a common English idiom, writing that "you cannot eat your cake and have it too," rather than the standard phrasing. They also shared unique, archaic spellings and highly specific hyphenation patterns. These lexical microsignatures formed a chain of linguistic evidence that was statistically impossible to attribute to mere coincidence. This precise forensic linguistic analysis formed the absolute cornerstone of the FBI's legal strategy moving forward. The undeniable linguistic alignment provided the necessary probable cause to secure a federal search warrant for a remote, heavily wooded property in Montana. For the first time in American legal history, a search warrant of this magnitude relied heavily on the scientific comparison of language, proving that words could hold the exact same evidentiary weight as physical forensics. In April 1996, heavily armed federal agents converged on a small, deeply isolated cabin in the Montana wilderness. The tactical approach was executed with extreme caution, given the suspect's known lethal expertise with improvised explosives. The transition from a nationwide theoretical manhunt to a physical, high-stakes confrontation at a 10 by 12-foot wooden structure marked the dramatic climax of the longest investigation in the history of the Postal Inspection Service.
Inside the dimly lit cabin, the physical reality perfectly mirrored the abstract linguistic profile. Investigators discovered a manual typewriter, active bomb-making materials, and thousands of pages of meticulously handwritten journals. The chain of custody was rigorously maintained as agents documented the origin point of the decades-long terror campaign. The journals contained explicit, undeniable references to the bombings, confirming the linguistic analysis and bridging the final gap between the written word and the physical crimes. The successful raid resulted in the immediate, unresisting arrest of Ted Kaczynski, the elusive phantom who had paralyzed the postal system for 17 years was finally secured in federal custody. The arrest completely validated the FBI's unprecedented, controversial gamble to publish the Manifesto, and it cemented the tragic but heroic role of David Kaczynski in preventing further loss of life. The untraceable bomber was ultimately undone entirely by his own arrogant compulsion to communicate. During the subsequent, highly publicized legal proceedings, the overwhelming weight of the forensic linguistics and the recovered physical evidence severely limited the defense's options. Facing an insurmountable mountain of circumstantial and direct evidence, the defense team struggled to mount any viable strategy. The linguistic analysis had not only definitively identified the suspect, but it had preemptively dismantled any legal attempt to deny authorship of the explosives or the manifesto itself. Ted Kaczynski ultimately entered a guilty plea, accepting multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The resolution of the Unabomber case revolutionized modern criminal investigations across the globe. It firmly established forensic linguistics as a vital court-approved discipline, proving that the deep architecture of human language can be as precise and damning as a drop of blood or a spent casing. The pursuit of justice had fundamentally evolved, learning to read the invisible fingerprints left behind in the silent spaces between words.